I will take that as a yes and go ahead. All right. So hello, everyone. I'm Abhishek Dedhe. I'm a third year PhD student at Carnegie Mellon in Dr. Jessica Cantlin's lab. And today I'll be talking about the building blocks of recursive pattern processing in human adults, children, and monkeys. So let's begin with patterns. So humans readily perceive and produce patterns, and patterns are diverse. They range from simple to complex, from perceptual to conceptual, from local to global. They're everywhere. In this talk, we will be focusing on a specific type of patterns, that is recursive patterns. And there's a lot of definitions of recursion out there. We will keep it simple, where we mean recursive patterns to include things embedded within other things of the same kind. Specifically, we refer to those sorts of recursive patterns which are seen in fields like mathematics, music, and language. Now, recursion is a hallmark of rich abstract cognition. And over the past couple of decades, there's been a lot of discussion, debates about whether it might be unique to humans. One way people typically study these recursion is using what are called artificial grammar learning tasks. And in these tasks, typically people are presented with grammaticality judgments, and it's not just people, it can also be like other species, it can be pre-linguistic infants. And people often have to make a grammaticality judgment about, whether a sentence is acceptable or not. In our paradigm, we, instead of grammaticality judgments, we have a sequence generation task, which our lab has been using. And the way this task works is you have a series of images, like stimuli, which are spread across randomly on the screen, as you can see on the right. And participants must generate a sequence composed of the items scattered on the screen. So they need to learn particular lists. And in our case, like, there are two lists which participants need to learn or master successfully. So, like, just to give you an example of how that works, so you'll see an example where participants fail to learn the list twice, and on their third time, they actually get the correct list completely. And this is training list 1. See, they got it wrong. Wrong again. All right. So yeah, so this is how they learn these lists. I think some important features of this task is, like, this training, as you see, it involves discovering the correct sequence, so to speak. They're not told beforehand what the right order is. Even though, like, I'll be showing you these lists as, arranged as linear sequences, they're scrambled up in a non-linear sequence display. And importantly, the test phase is where we have an open-ended sequence generation task. And by open-ended, we mean that there's no selective feedback given for generating any particular sequence. Participants could generate any of the 4 factorial, that is 24 potential sequences. And importantly, in the test condition, participants are shown these stimuli which they've never seen together before. So just to give you an example of, participants, like, producing whatever sequence they want and still getting a correct feedback. Yeah. So this is like a general overview of how the task works. So who were the people who took part in this task? So we had 94 adults, which we collected the data from Amazon MTurk. We also had kids at the age range 3 to 5. And also we had 3 rhesus macaques. And part of this data is available online on GitHub. Now, one important aspect to point out over here is that relational information or support may facilitate recursion. So in these, so the definition of what relational reasoning we're using over here is just the ability to identify perceptual or conceptual links between 2 or more objects, items. So in the so-called bracket stimuli, which we used over here, there were two sort of relational dimensions. The first was of form, which included shape and color. So there were three different forms. And then there was orientation, whether the brackets were rightward facing or leftward facing. So we wanted to see whether this relational support plays an important role. So in the first condition, which was our perceptual support condition, we had these bracket stimuli where we had two relational dimensions, form and orientation. In the semantic condition, we had these words where, in this case, the two dimensions, relational dimensions, which we manipulated were species and age. And we also had a no support condition where there were no obvious relations between, we used arbitrary shape stimuli, so no obvious relations between them. And the number of sides, the color, like none of those things, there was no obvious relational link between them. So as I mentioned, right, participants could generate a total of 24, that is 4 factorial potential sequences. Just to walk you through some of the sequences they could generate what we call these tail embedded sequences, where you have brackets of the same kind right next to each other. So it's an ABAB structure. They could generate these cross sequences where which is like the structure which you see in front of you. And finally, they could also generate these center embedded sequences, which feature these nested long-range dependencies. I should mention that this is not all of the possible sequences that could be generated. This is just some of them. Importantly, center embedded sequences have been considered to be behavioral markers of supra-regular context-free grammars, or very simply, they're often been considered to be behavioral markers of recursive pattern processing. Just to give you an idea of how these sequences would play out with the animal stimuli. So this is how the tail embedded sequences would look like. So dog, puppy, sheep, lamb, or sheep, lamb, dog, puppy. That's an example of tail embedded sequences in the semantic support condition. Cross sequences and center embedded sequences also they have a very analogous structure, which you saw in the with the brackets in the perceptual support condition. So what are the results, right? If all of that was too much detail, the key takeaway was that we had adults and children and monkeys performing these different conditions, and we took a look at what types of sequences are they generating. And we saw that across relational support conditions, where there was relational support, adults and children were preferentially generating center embedded sequences. When there was no support for adults, or even when there was perceptual support for the monkeys, they were generating an equal amount of center embedded and cross sequences. Now, this is the behavioral data. Just as I reiterated, like adults and children, they use relational support to generate center embedded sequences, but when that support is taken away for humans, or even when it is present, like in the case for monkeys, they generate an equal amount of crossed and center embedded sequences. Now, we are not merely interested in what behavior sequences participants are generating, but we are also interested in what kind of cognitive mechanisms might be giving rise to this behavior. So we considered 3 potential cognitive mechanisms of increasing complexity. At the simplest mechanism was associative chaining, similar to statistical learning, which is just extracting the transition probabilities between items. And I'll be going through these mechanisms again in the next few slides. Then we have ordinal reasoning. And finally, we have hierarchical reasoning. And I'll talk through what these mechanisms are. So as I mentioned, associative chaining would involve extracting the transition probabilities of the which you saw in the training sequences. So if you were using associative chaining, that would lead you to generate these tail embedded sequences. Because that's the transition probabilities. That's what you saw during learning. Now, if you was using ordinal knowledge, that would involve each item in the training being assigned a list position, so that you have this one occurring first, this one coming second, this one coming third, this one coming fourth. And if you were just paying attention to ordinal position, if you were just satisfying that constraint, you would generate an equal amount of these crossed and center embedded sequences. Both of them would be valid. Finally, if you were using only hierarchical reasoning, which is typically considered to use these mental representations called nested tree structures, you would selectively generate center embedded sequences. So we formalized these predictions of what a different cognitive mechanism would generate in this probability matrix. So we have, these are different cognitive mechanisms, and we have, what types of responses they would lead to. And we also had a random catch-all mechanism, noise parameter, where all of the 24 sequences were, equally likely to be generated. So then we ran a Bayesian model, a Dirichlet mixture model specifically, where we used the no U-turn sampling algorithm. We implemented an RSTAN, and essentially what we were calculating was the probability of using any particular cognitive mechanism, given that you're observing these particular behavioral responses, these sequences which people have generated. So just to get noise out of the way, one important takeaway was, some participants are noisy, and you can see that noise increased as you went from the adults to the children to finally like the adults with no support and monkeys with the perceptual support condition. But really, going to the meat of the matter, which is the cognitive mechanisms, so this is an example of the data of all of the 32 participants who took part in the no support condition, the adults. So this is just all of these 32 participants. And in the future slides, I'll be showing you these bar graphs, which you see on the right, which is just an average of what people are doing across mechanism, of average across individuals. So like you can see in this no support condition that most of it, is ordinal reasoning. However, you do see some hierarchical and associative chaining as well. So another graph which I will be showing you is the most dominant cognitive mechanism which people are using. So for example, in this case, all of these folks over here, they are predominantly hierarchical reasoners. So I would be also showing you these sort of pie charts which show the most dominant cognitive mechanism used by each individuals. So what do we see, right? So beginning with the adults, we see that across the two relational support conditions, adults are preferentially producing relying on hierarchical reasoning. However, when this relational support is taken away, adults go down to ordinal reasoning. Though I should mention that even when there is no relational support, there are some adults who can indeed rely on hierarchical reasoning. Moving to the children. The children are actually, as an average, they're not using hierarchical reasoning any more than they're using ordinal reasoning, though, like, if you take a look at each individual using dominant strategies, you see like there are like the most predominant strategy is indeed hierarchical reasoning. However, for children, there's a mix of hierarchical and ordinal reasoning. And finally, when you go to the monkeys, you see that the monkeys are predominantly using ordinal reasoning mechanisms. So just to summarize these results, we have, the top row, which is the humans, that humans use hierarchical mechanisms across domains and most frequently when relational support is available. You take that relational support away, they rely on ordinal reasoning. For children, some of them use hierarchical mechanisms, while others use ordinal ones. And finally, monkeys use ordinal mechanisms. So what can we, more generally conclude from these results? So one conclusion, some of the conclusions which we have are, the first is that hierarchical reasoning is a critical building block of recursive pattern processing. Second, relational support drives hierarchical reasoning and thus facilitates recursive sequence generation. And third, ordinal reasoning may be more developmentally and evolutionally primary than hierarchical reasoning. When human adults, children, and monkeys cannot find relational structure to build a hierarchy, they default down to ordinal reasoning. These are all of the conclusions in a nutshell. Going ahead, what are some unresolved questions or some future directions which we are exploring? So in this case, of course, there was only 4 items, or there was only one depth of embedding. But to truly test whether the generalizability of this ability, we are seeing whether participants can, generalize these to novel depths, larger depths than what they've seen before. And we are seeing that, adults and children can do that, but, they struggle. Furthermore, we are interested in what the learning trajectory will be, both in real time, like when people are doing tasks, in a 20-minute, 30-minute session, but also over a developmental time. So, tracking the same kids over a period of time, and the evolutionary aspects. Like prior research has shown that monkeys can indeed use hierarchical mechanisms. It's not as if they can't do it. So what changed over evolutionary time that allowed that made that transition, which allowed humans to rely on hierarchical reasoning more preferentially? And finally, of course, there's the role of memory, what kind of memory constraints play a role over here. And also, what kind of prior knowledge do humans and monkeys show? Like what inductive biases from them could we then, extrapolate and, feed into something like a simple recurrent network? Or, of course, there are more sophisticated AI models out there, but even if you stick with simple connectionist modeling, it would be interesting to see. So yeah, that's all I have. Thank you everyone in my lab for the support. And yeah, thank you everyone in the audience for listening to this talk. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.